Some of you may become somewhat uncomfortable as parts of this film unfold, but I think if you listen carefully...
Nature has intended that you bound to be a
A healthy, happy sex life is a most wonderful and exciting. We've all experienced curiosity about ourselves and the opposite sex. Who hasn't?
Hello, my ethical sluts. I'm Megan.
I'm Marcella.
And I'm Colin.
And welcome to
Remedial Sex Ed. That one was pretty good.
Nailed it.
We're doing another book report episode today.
Yes. I'm very excited to talk about it.
Marcella, do you want to introduce the book?
Oh, sure. So this one doesn't make me angry, so there will be less yelling, at least on my part. So what we read this time, is The Ethical Slut, and we're using the 3rd edition, and it's written by Janet W. Hardy and Dossie Easton. And the number one thing I want to highlight with these 3 editions is they actually grew with time, and they took in new information about gender and, sexualities, and they adapted their book to include those things, as well as also being intersectional feminists. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a direct comparison there to Joy of Sex because these authors really did the work. And this was published in 1997. They've already had 3 editions, and they've done a ton of work towards addressing changing social attitudes and new research, and also just new ways of expressing one's new gender and sexual orientation expressions. Mm-hmm. And so they've done a great job.
I mean, I absolutely love this book. I loved it from beginning to end. As a monogamist, there's some things in there that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think they got gender down correctly. I think they got sex down great. And actually, a lot of the advice they have in this book, I think, is applicable to everyone, regardless of how you identify.
Agreed. I think that the fundamentals that they talk about and they list about having a healthy relationship isn't just about having a plural relationship. It definitely applies to monogamy, or as they discuss in the book, just loving yourself.
Or platonic friend relationships. But it sort of stands to reason that if you're going to have a romantic or sexual relationship with a lot of different people, then you have to be a good communicator.
Absolutely.
And so much of this book is about developing good communication skills and owning your feelings and really examining your beliefs and attitudes. And there's a lot that anybody could take away from this.
Yeah, we've been up at a mammoth cabin that my company owns this weekend with a bunch of people, all who are straight monogamous people, and I've been recommending it to all of them.
Yay!
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And I'm recommending it on this podcast right now.
We're only a couple minutes in, but I think it's going to get our seal of approval.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Passed. It has passed for me. I've already read the book once. I went through it and did a refresher read. And I think it was really interesting for me because I've been in such different places, reading the book the first time around versus this time around. Whereas the first time around, I, got the recommendation from a bi guy, who I met online, and he was basically opening my idea to how this works in the world and how people have made this successful. And then this time around, I am coming at it from a post-breakup perspective. I mean, it's been a while, but still, I'm very much post-breakup and reading about the different ways to communicate with someone or seeing the healthy ways to do something or to look for in a partner. All of that kind of stuff was definitely a new perspective for me. So I think no matter what stage you're at or what you're looking for, this book is a really great read.
Do we want to start with kind of an introduction to who Janet Hardy and Dossie Easton are before we go into the details?
Yes.
Sure.
So, according to the book, they have a whole intro to the two of them. Dossie Easton is a licensed marriage and family therapist specializing in alternative sexualities and relationships with more than 25 years of experience counseling open relationships. You can hear a lot of what she has to offer in this book. She shares a lot of personal stories from cover to cover, and her expertise, I think, within therapy really shines through in this book. Her co-author, Janet W. Harding, is an author or co-author of 12 books and founder of Greenery Press, a publisher specializing in sexually adventurous books. She has an MFA in creative writing from St. Mary's College of California. Both of these authors are open about their polyamory. They have not been monogamous for decades. And interesting side note about Janet Harding is she has the pen name of Catherine Liszt, or Liszt, for which she used for the time that her kids were growing up. And I actually kind of agree with her on that, in the sense that she owns up to her polyamory. She's open about her relationship status, but for the time that her kids were growing up, she didn't want to put that pressure on them. She wanted to keep it her own business and kind of like keep the mothering that she had with her kids out of the public eye. I mean, despite the fact that her kids knew that she was polyamorous the entire
I think,
time.
it was, she didn't want to out her kids. So I think, that was a good move.
Yeah, I think that, which I'm sure we'll get to, but the chapter on raising kids in the polyamory scene was really fascinating because you could see that they both had taken into consideration, like, how much this would impact their children's lives, what that would mean, what are good boundaries. And I think having the pen name was an excellent boundary that they came up with.
Colin and I actually, so we have both the paper copy of the book in front of us. We also listened to it as an audiobook. We just last weekend did a shotgun trip to and from the western side of Colorado, which was a 14-hour drive there and a 14-hour drive back.
Yes. We had a lot of time for audiobooks.
That we did. And now that is more than enough time to actually finish the book. But what had happened was, is we made it 3/4 of the way through. And what happened is in the third quarter of this book, there's a huge emphasis on communication and talking about jealousy or certain things that may create road bumps in a relationship. Now, they're talking a lot of times with using the context of jealousy within polyamory, but what it happened was Colin and I were listening to the chapters and got inspired to actually have an open discussion about how these things impact our own relationship. So we had to take a sidebar, and it triggered actually a really healthy, really serious communication between the two of us, which I think resulted in all positive things.
Yeah.
But this book actually had a really positive impact on a monogamous relationship.
Yeah, positive personal impact. We had a great conversation, and I think we're better off for it.
Yeah, so I don't know if they knew that would happen, but it totally did.
I'm sure they did. I mean, one of them's a family therapist, so
also true.
I think she meant that you definitely. I mean, this book is sort of interestingly structured. It's equal parts. I like to think of it as equal parts manifesto and like self-help workbook.
Yeah.
So there, in addition to outlining this system of ethical sluthood, at the end of each lesson, there is a little homework assignment where you make a list. One of them is like making a list of sluts, which is sort of like helping you to combat your own like sexual prejudices. One thing that really surprised me about this book was how was all the practical applications that are right there.
Yeah, I loved the exercises. There were a few that I thought were, most of them were really applicable to any kind of relationship that you have. And it talks a lot about doing like the inner work within yourself to know like what is going to make you happy, what is going to turn you on, what are things that you like that sexually stimulate you, or how do you get yourself to orgasm? Like all of these things are very applicable just to oneself. So it's awesome to hear that you guys were able to have such a healthy conversation with each other. That's cool.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to finish the book, and I'd like to do some of the exercises at least. Yeah,
and I before we started recording, I definitely read a lot of part 4 to also get together, because part 4 has some great chapters even within it regarding like the ebb and flow of relationships, couples and groups, sex and pleasure. It talks about breakups, which I would like to touch on at the end of this episode. It really is fantastic. I think some of the exercises that I absolutely loved was to write down 15 ways to be kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Which I think everyone should just do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is anger good for? Because I think we think of anger and jealousy always as really negative emotions. And jealousy, I think, is negative if you lash out with it. But if you can have a mature reflection in about why you're feeling jealous, whether it's something that is your own baggage or is someone else genuinely treating you poorly, I think to really comprehend and face these sometimes associated as negative emotions head on, you'll actually see that these exist for a reason. And there are positive driving forces. Like anger, if you use it correctly, protects you from being treated unfairly.
Yeah, and one point they hit on repeatedly is they are trying to get their readers to own their emotions, own their feelings in all ways possible. So, the authors invite the reader to own their own sexual desires and to find ways to express these things sexually that they may have always wanted to do but been too ashamed or oppressed or afraid to do. But it's also about owning your emotions in terms of anger and jealousy, but also in happiness and joy. The authors just want you... Part of their ethical system is being conscientious and mindful of the choices you make, and not letting, basically making sure that your choices and your emotions are your own, and that they're under your control and working towards how you want to be rather than working against you.
Yeah.
So Marcella, as someone who, you've never wanted to be married, you've always had kind of polyamory within you, what was it like reading this book for the first time?
So, so ever since I was a little kid, I've always said that I never wanted to get married. And, I will say, like, I'm on the fence about it now. Having had a really good partner made me realize, okay, if they're interested in these kinds of things, then maybe I can make it work. But the first time I read this book, it was very much like, oh, okay, so one, I'm not completely weird for not having any attachment to the idea of marriage. Cool. Because before this, everyone had always been like, oh, you're a child of divorce, so you never want to get married. And I'm like, okay, thanks. No, I just also don't think that it would bring me any joy. Two, I think some really important highlights for me first reading it were the communities. I think it opened me up to a lot of kink-friendly information, like knowing about munches, knowing about like cuddle parties and things like that, which happen at the end of the book. I think that was a really great way for me to research, what communities do I want to be a part of? And then the biggest thing for me was the ethical part of being a slut. Because, like, I've always been very sexually free, but I think there was always this like underlying guilt or reservation or just judgment on my lifestyle. And then this book was like, okay, but here's all the ways that you can do it happy and healthily and keep everybody involved, like aware of what's going on, aware of where you're at. And so I think the biggest thing for me was learning the communication aspect, because I think for a while it was very much trying to please people by just telling them what they wanted to hear, or having partners that didn't want to hear about my other lifestyle and keeping it a secret and in shame. And then realizing like, no, if I want a partner to be in my life, then they have to be okay with this lifestyle, and they have to be able to like want to hear about my other partners, or just be able to negotiate all of this. I don't know.
I really like that last part, because I think for me, if people the want to have sex with multiple people makes sense, and because duh, and really what makes cheating horrible isn't necessarily the aspect of having desire or acting on that desire for someone else. It is lying to another person,
yeah,
making a promise to them and breaking that trust. That is essentially what makes cheating unethical. And if you are in a position where you and your partner can negotiate around honestly a series of rules of having a polyamorous relationship, or if you're not in a committed relationship, being able to say openly to someone else, like, yo, we're dating, but I'm also dating 5 other people.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You know, that's the ethical way to do it, instead of lying, which I encountered a lot growing up, because my father was very much an unethical slut. Like, after my parents got divorced, he would date 12 women at the same time, and he would have us, his children, like, lie about his relationship status. That's not okay. That is exactly the way to be unethical about it. Whereas being open and saying, like, I am doing all this that's fine.
Yeah. And it just comes back to communication, and all the way back to episode 1, consent. They don't talk, there isn't a separate chapter on consent in this, but it's sort of a through line running through the entire book that, things are better when everyone is consenting. And what's absolutely crucial to this ethical system is that everyone involved consents, and they know they can withdraw their consent, and that there are clear boundaries and rules that everyone establishes and abides by, and that's what ends up making it work.
It's actually on page 53.
Oh, I see.
It's called Building a Culture of Consent.
Oh, okay. Well,
but no, they talk about how there's how we're gaining awareness of the enormous prevalence of sexual assault and smaller sexual aggressions. Literally reading this. But bringing into consciousness something that we have avoided thinking about usually requires some thrashing around. When we claim our sexual freedoms and start building communities wherein we can express ourselves in a sex-positive way, we immediately bump up against the truth that we are living in a society that holds some insane values about sex and consent. When it is not safe, accepted, or welcome to say no thank you to sex, building a sex-positive culture can become impossible. So they're talking about, and this entire chapter, because I remember really loving this in the book, was talking about how it is important to start with being polite and direct with the no thank you, and then only having to build upon that if the situation becomes dangerous, but also very much, being excited and positive and saying yes. Essentially everything that we harped on about in episode 1. And of course, later on, they address trauma survivors, they address people who have been accused, and they also talk about how women are basically raised to not say no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they do address it at the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, that's a great correction to make. But it is definitely there, and it's definitely central to their ethical framework that they're building here. Another thing that they bring up as being central, there are a couple central ideas to this book. One of them that they mention in the introduction, I think, is sort of like the slut's credo, which is that, oh shoot, where's the exact quote? Okay, here it is. It's that sex is nice and pleasure is good for you, and that's one of the central ideas that they have running through this book.
Which, yes.
Also, yes. Well, that sort of runs counter to a lot of the, to what we are taught about sex, especially growing up in Utah, that sex is bad and pleasure is bad, and you shouldn't pursue it. And you certainly shouldn't pursue it as an ends unto itself, as we are in this book. But they're, of course, trying to flip that paradigm on its head a little bit and saying that sex and pleasure are things that are good in and of themselves. And it is, not only is it okay, but it is good and ethical for you to pursue those things as ends unto themselves and not for any other reason, like reproduction or marriage or that sort of thing.
So this book did, when we started, kind of send me into some form of existential reflection.
Okay.
Because what they had to say about marriage in a lot of ways, I agree with. So if I open up to page 222, they question the idea of marriage a lot. They harp on how the narrative of one correct way to have a marriage with a working father, stay-at-home mother, till death do us part. A lot of them calling it they called it negative throughout the book, and I agree with most of that. You know, their issues with marriage have been my issues with marriage for most of my life. And it really made me go into a deep thought process, because I always knew that I would eventually get married. I always knew that I would eventually settle into monogamy. I really enjoy my current marriage, but it really made me kind of sit and like think why, you know, because I agree with them, but also I wanted to have an answer prepared for why I disagree with them. And I think the reason why I disagree with them is because I don't have that marriage. You know, I go to work. You know, Colin does most of the cooking and cleaning. We have an equal partnership. And ultimately, when it comes down to monogamy, I was really, really trying to reflect as to why. And, you know, before I started dating Colin, it was not irregular for me to be dating 3 to 5 people at the same time. And I was really trying to think why that ended. And I have no better answer other than it just did. And I'm just happy with it. And I've got nothing better than that.
Yeah, I think, well said, Meg. You know, as a therapist, Eaton in particular is interested in causing the reader to confront subconscious, prejudicial, and inherited beliefs about sex relationships and sexuality. In the ethical system that they're setting out to create, the authors approve of any sexual / relationship choice that is made, as long as it's informed, consensual, and conscious. So they do sort of rag on traditional monogamy in the beginning, but I don't think they're obviously not against marriage. They're just against going along with these inherited beliefs without examining them. To our authors, you know, an asexual celibate life and a vigorously sexual polyamorous life are equally good and valid and ethical, as long as all the people involved come to those decisions freely and joyfully in the best of their knowledge.
Yeah, and I think the main thing they're against is forcing yourself to live a life that is not true to you. And we grew up in a culture where I think a lot of people force themselves into that traditional marriage that we described because it's seen as the one path. And so I think that's what they're against. Like, if you are truly, if you want to be a stay-at-home mom, like, I fully support you. That is a tough, thankless job. And if that's what makes you happy, more power to you. Like, if you are in for the traditional mold, like, that's fantastic. But really forcing yourself to do it if you're not for it is more of what they're getting at.
Or pushing that agenda on everybody else that doesn't agree with your views.
Yes.
Yeah. No, and I think that they support and agree with you, Megan. I think even in the book on marriage, the part on marriage that you referenced, they talk about how it's like, they're talking about the government view on marriage versus what is actually real. And they agree with you. The marriage that is outlined to support couples in legislation is very different than what a majority of marriages look like today.
In their perfect world, they would remove the marriage license from the equation. They would make it so that marriage isn't necessarily a legal thing. It's more of a spiritual thing. And I could go on a whole rant about marriage, but I think that's a different podcast episode. But just as a fun fact, the only reason that the marriage license exists is because of Utah and polygamy.
Oh, really?
That is a true story.
I did not know that.
The government, and I can't remember if the US or the UK did it first, but they basically made it mandatory that you had to register a marriage with the government to ensure that there was only one to end the polygamous movement of the Mormon Church.
Oh, wow.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Also, why? Not that I am in huge support of the FLDS movement as a whole, but I just want to know why we decided that you couldn't have more than one wife or husband. What does that solve?
It seems unnecessary.
I think the argument from a tax break point of position is that could be easily abused. Of being like, these are all my wives. I need 6 marriage tax breaks. But I think it's also a stupid argument. I have really complex feelings about polygamy because all the times I saw it growing up, it seemed it was not a consensual agreement.
No.
Like, if there's a 15-year-old who's being forced to marry a 45-year-old, which you see in the FLDS movement and in the off-branch communities of Utah, that's not ethical.
For our listeners, FLDS is the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints Church that is an offshoot of the main Mormon church. They're disavowed by the official LDS church.
Yes, polygamy has been illegal in the state of Utah and not a part of the LDS church for many, many years.
Since Utah's
do not
origin.
get it confused.
Yeah, since Utah became a state.
That was the defining rule.
Yeah, it's part of the agreement.
Which we can do a separate episode on all the ethical ramifications that decision had, but yeah, that's kind of my issue with polygamy is I'm for it in theory because people should be free to do as they consensually choose. I just am concerned about the times where polygamy is not consensual.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why it remains illegal.
Yeah.
I thought something that would be really interesting would be to go through and list all of the slut skills.
Ooh.
Oh, okay.
Because I think that they're relevant to everyone and not just sluts. I really like the opening sentence of chapter 9. Great sluts are made, not born. So here's the direct quote. In most of the world, slut is a highly offensive term used to describe a woman whose sexuality is voracious, indiscriminate, and shameful. It's interesting to note that the analogous words stud or player used to describe a highly sexual man are often terms of approval and envy. We have a problem with this. So we are proud to reclaim the word slut as a term of approval, even endearment. To us, a slut is a person of any gender who celebrates sexuality according to the radical proposition that sex is nice and pleasure is good for you.
What are our slut skills?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first slut skill is communication. Learning to talk clearly and listen effectively is critical. Emotional honesty. Being able to ask for and receive reassurance and support is crucial. Affection. It's vital to be able to give reassurance and support, both in response to a request and on your own. Faithfulness. If you have one or more primary relationships, take a look at what you can do to reinforce their primary. Many people in long-term relationships have certain activities that they keep for only their life partners, which I thought was interesting that faithfulness is like important in sluthood, right? It seems like counterintuitive, but there's ways to be faithful to your partner and still be a part of this lifestyle. Planning. Successful sluts know that relationships don't just happen. They take work, planning, and commitment. Knowing yourself. We are all carrying a lot of garbage in our minds about sex and gender. Some of these beliefs are buried so deep that they can drive our behavior unconsciously, creating confusion and causing a great deal of pain to ourselves and the people we love. Owning your feelings. Basic precept of intimate communication is that each person owns their own feelings. No one makes you feel jealous or insecure. The person who makes you feel that way is you. And if you're the only person that can make you feel that way, you're the only person that can fix that. The next one is going easy on yourself. As prepared and centered and stable as you are going to trip over problems you never anticipated. Perhaps the most important step in dealing with problems is to recognize that they will happen and that it's okay that they do. And then they mentioned a friend of theirs that called these AFOG, or AFOG, another fucking opportunity for growth. And then the final one is telling the truth. Throughout your experience, as you feel pain, ambivalence, joy, you must speak your own truth, first to yourself and then to those around you. Silence, suffering, and self-deception have no place in this lifestyle. Which, yeah, I mean, I know we highlighted a few that were especially critical to all relationships, but I really would say that all of this is important.
One thing, I forget where in the book it talks about this, but they mention safe words, which, you know, usually gets associated with the kink culture, but then they mention safe words for a social situation that you want out of, or if you're having a conversation and you don't have the emotional energy to have that conversation right now. That's actually something that Colin and I picked up on, of like having a safe word to be like, I need to pause this fight, or I need to pause this situation because I can't handle it right now, but I promise you we'll come back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really loved the way that they discussed fighting or like having an argument. They had an entire section on it where they were just like, think about, you know, what things will trigger you. Talk to your partner about that. Set up the safe words that you just mentioned, and how to have a healthy argument. You know, like how to not be a toxic fight, how to actually have a conversation that leaves you wanting more, or even their tip to write a letter and then spend the next few days like editing the letter and coming down to the points of what you were actually feeling and what the frustrations were, and deleting all of the rage posting. And then either don't send the letter or start a conversation about the letter, you know, do something productive and healthy.
And that's important for every type of relationship. Polyamorous, friendship. Like, if you think for 2 seconds that you're going to be in some form of romantic relationship and never fight with this person, you are very mistaken.
No, in fact, the book suggests to seek out conflict in a healthy way rather than trying to avoid it, which for me is something that like I could definitely apply more to my life. And they even suggested to schedule a time and time limit for your fights.
It's chapter 16 in the book, Embracing Conflict, and I just would really recommend that everybody read this because I think it's important in all of our lives to be able to find a way to resolve conflict healthy and effectively and in a way that isn't damaging one or more people. And they really emphasize that, you know, arguments have to be win-win. You can't go into them being like, oh, I won this argument, because then you're just hurting the other person.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the arguments get out of control or multiple, or if this relationship is no longer fulfilling your needs, there is a section near the end of the book in regards to breakups, which actually has some great advice, again, for everyone in it. They talk about kind of ethical breakups in the 21st century. The first piece of advice that they have is don't post everything you have to say on social media. Your ex may be a total douche, but broadcasting all of that onto the internet in a way that you can't take back may not be the best outlet for you. I think the best way to handle breakups is in a situation that isn't being recorded with some of your closest friends or family, and being able to kind of yell all of that out, which is necessary. Like, even if your ex is a lovely person, but you're still feeling angry that it's over, like, finding someone to be like, fuck that person, in the privacy of a room that's not going to go outside of it, I think is healthy and important to remember.
Mm-hmm.
I will say they did mention that, like, if they are abusive or mentally abusive or that kind of thing, that's not something that you necessarily need to be private about. It's all the other stuff. Like, if you're just like, oh, he was so manipulative and I hate him and he's such a douche to me, like all of the stuff that normal breakups are about, then yeah, like definitely don't broadcast any of that. But if you're getting abused or anything like that, they were like, that's definitely something that's an ongoing issue that would affect their other relationships, and it's not fair to the victim to keep that inside.
Truth. I will own up to my own guilt in something that they talked about in breakups. The quote is, many people approach the ending of a relationship as if they have been given a license for drama. I freaking love gossip. I'm trying to be better about it. But I mean, I'm pretty guilty about that, of like hearing about someone else's breakup, about like, give me all the details, or when I would break up with someone, of like probably oversharing with some friends and being very into the drama of the situation and be like, oh, this is all the worst thing that's ever happened to anyone ever, when actually it was just a normal ass breakup.
I very much try to be friends with my exes, probably a little too quickly. But I really enjoyed everything that they had to say about, like, you know, taking some time to cool off and then coming back to the relationship, and like, still valuing the person that's on the other side. Like, if you are in love with somebody, then they have really good qualities that, you know, don't end just because you're not with them anymore. And so I think I will forever cherish the way that they ended the breakup chapter, which is a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. But after all, my erstwhile dear, my no longer cherished, need we say it wasn't love just because it perished? Which I think is so great.
I think it is important in any relationship. Like, the two of you, or more of you, the number of you, were together for a reason. And you stayed together for as long as you stayed together, also for a reason. And breakups are tough, and exes are called exes for a reason. But I think it's also healthy to look back and say, I had some really great times.
Yeah.
And whether you share those memories with others or whether those are memories just for you, I kind of like that I have some memories that are just for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And aren't shared with anyone else except, I guess, that other person. But, you know, to look back on them fondly and be like, there were some really good times there. I think it's healthy for everyone to do that.
Yeah. I think that they also like what we brought up in the last episode around bisexuals and the general disbelief around them. One interesting in the breakup chapter is how when a traditional marriage breaks up, nobody takes that as evidence that monogamy doesn't work. So why do people feel compelled to take a slut's breakup as evidence that free love is impossible? Your breakup may be for reasons unrelated to the openness of your relationship. At any rate, it isn't evidence that you aren't meant to be a slut. And I think that's really important because I think a lot of people will be like, oh, well, see, your relationships aren't going on forever, so that means that they don't have value. And I just don't understand the idea that if something only lasts a few years, it isn't as valuable as a monogamous relationship that lasts forever. Like, I get to experience multiple people that help me grow at different stages of my life and teach me different things depending on what we both need at that point of time. And I think that that's really excellent and important. And I hate that people see these breakups as like, oh yeah, see, like, you need to find somebody that's for forever.
Yeah.
Well, they also, one of the closing statements of what you just talked about, a common argument of marriage and monogamy is, aren't you afraid of dying alone? And the author Dossie makes an excellent point that, of course, she's afraid of being alone. Like, she doesn't enjoy necessarily being alone, but her mother outlived her father by 30 years. And both sets of my grandparents, the grandfather died first. You know, all sorts of marriages end and they have to go on without their other partner. So the argument for marriage isn't necessarily a guaranteed partner for all time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And even outside of death, the divorce rate in this country is 50%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And no one uses that to say, well, actually, people do, never mind.
All the time.
All the time people do use that to say marriage doesn't work.
Yeah.
And also, dear listener, you know, we all die alone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Colin.
It's all something that we have to face ourselves. You can't bring it with you, every man.
And I don't think necessarily you need to even be in a sexual relationship to feel companionship or feel love for another person.
And that's what they talk about in the book, is that they have their community that they've built with people that they are partners with or have been partners with or their partners were partners with, and they all are invested in each other's health and happiness, and they've raised children together, and they plan on taking care of each other in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Coming back to the bisexual thing, they noted this in the menage a trois section of it, of like how monogamous couples will abuse their bisexual friends and thinking that they're like plaything,
yeah,
to excuse the threesome instead of finding someone that they both genuinely enjoy,
yeah,
and respect and want, and we're like, we should have sex.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and that's you know, this book isn't for that kind of person. This is a much deeper sort of manifesto. Yeah,
this manifesto is not to be like, you get to force your partner into crazy sexual situations. This is not a book for, you know, salacious details of even the author's, like, sexual details. They share what's important in the context of the book, but really this is just a
It's how to have relationships.
Yeah.
It's a self-help book.
Yeah, it is. At the end of the day, it kind of is.
Yeah.
Also, stop abusing your bisexual friends.
Yeah.
They're not objects.
This book
They're not
actually
unicorns.
helped me come back to terms with the term bisexual, because I hated it. I still kind of do. But for the reason that they listed at the very beginning, where bisexual is like often taken to mean that my reason for not necessarily liking the word is it, in my opinion, affirms the two gender belief.
Ooh.
Just by being bisexual. And that isn't what it means at all. Like at the very beginning of this book, they go into, you can be bisexual and want emotional relationships with women and sexual relationships with men, or you can be bisexual and still be interested in people who are non-binary or intersex. Like the term is kind of a catch-all, but I definitely, the way to identify is hard because I definitely don't want people to think that I only believe in the two physical genders that well, actually, no, there are more than two genders that people are born with. We just refuse to talk about them. But, like, I don't want it to believe that I only believe in the male sex and the female sex. But this book kind of went into the details of like, hey, it's actually an all-encompassing term. There are these other terms that if you feel more comfortable using, then you can use those as well. But yeah, I really enjoyed their paragraph on bisexuality.
I think another thing that they talked about in the beginning was on terms of the gender or categorizing people into bisexuality, homosexuality, heterosexuality. When gender becomes fluid, does it matter? Yeah. And I like that approach. Does it actually matter?
Yeah, one author described an experience at a club in New York that was really popular with trans and non-binary people, and so that it, you would start dancing with someone whom you were attracted to, but you didn't necessarily know what their gender was or what kind of equipment they had, and so she described it as that's that sort of situation forming a basic expectation of respect and communication where you had to actually talk to someone and say like, hey, I think you're attractive. What are you into? What are you, can I buy you a drink? What are you, wanting out of this? I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Getting to know the human, not just the exterior.
Yeah. Not just the genitals.
It's not just about genitals.
It's not.
I mean, I love a good penis, but it's not just about genitals. Okay, I want to fast forward a bit to, they talk about, sex and pleasure. And they talk about how to get good at sex. Mm-hmm. And let me see if I can pull up the first quote, because I want to say it. Hold on. I think I lost it. Okay, so they talk about sex and pleasure and how to get good at sex. And one thing that they address is the ridiculous belief that the public has that because you have the equipment, you can just be naturally good at sex, which is something that we don't really have that belief about literally anything else. Like, you have to take piano lessons. Like, you have to go to school to learn math or how to read. Or another big thing about public school is learning how to actually interact with other people. And sex is the same. Like, you're not going to be great at it straight off the bat, and you kind of have to learn through trial and error of how to be good at it. But the fundamentals that they give, I 1,000% agree with. They talk about how it begins with self, and the best way to start getting good at sex is masturbation, which I think I mentioned this in the virginity episode. Like, if you can't find your own pleasure, how is someone else supposed to do it? And they talk about that, like how, there was one of their friends who I don't think achieved orgasm until her mid-30s because that was the first time that she tried masturbation. And that's not uncommon for women, because I think men kind of get this hall pass to just be constantly touching themselves through puberty, and then they get that hall pass for the rest of their life, whereas women, they don't talk about it as much. There's a lot more shyness in it. And I think the excuse they gave in public education is like, well, men always have to touch their penises to pee, and so they can jerk off. That's a bullshit excuse. Everyone can masturbate. Anyway, and then on top of that, they say the other two ways to do it is, again, communication. Like openly saying to someone what they're doing is working for you, or if you're not enjoying it, or maybe we should move on to something else, or, openly communicating. And the last thing is by finding ways that aren't strictly sexual encounters to start off with. They talk about how if you just take the time to provide someone with a massage, or to listen to them, or to cuddle, and it doesn't necessarily end in sex, that's not bad. And having those moments that are just pure intimacy between two people can later lead to phenomenal sex.
Mm-hmm.
End of rant.
No worries. Did you want the page number for that, by the way? Is there a quote that you want to read? It's 251.
I was looking through the section, and I didn't want to go for an exact quote, so I just gave her a summary of
great.
the entire section. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I thought you mentioned
unless there's anything that... there was a quote, but I'm good.
Okay.
I'm over it.
Great.
It's not out there in the world.
All right.
Beautiful. So at the very beginning of this section that we're just talking about, which is the section 4, Sluts in Love, one of the first things they talk about are, like defining what you're looking for, and then who you're looking for. And then they give you ideas as to how to find them, the where. But in the who you were looking for was an exercise that I love and adore, and I think everybody needs to go out and do, because I find our obsession with a specific model-esque look in society is hot, like super gross and unnerving and just wrong. But anyway, the exercise is called the airport game. The next time you find yourself in a public place, like an airport or mall, find a place to sit where you can look at people without drawing attention to yourself. Then, for each person you look at, imagine, what might be this person's lover's favorite thing about them? Do they have a strong stride, a sweet smile, bright eyes, powerful shoulders, hair that looks soft to touch? Pretty much everybody is or has been loved by someone. See whether you can see what makes this particular person lovable and lustworthy, even if they're not the kind of person you're used to seeing that way.
That's a great exercise.
That's a really great exercise.
I just love it.
Speaking of love, one thing that is really interesting about this book is that they are trying to teach the reader not to see love as a zero-sum game, and they give the example of parents. Like, parents can have multiple children and not love any one of them less, although they may have their favorites at different times. And so the book encourages you to see romantic and sexual love the same way. It's just because you can have multiple partners doesn't mean you love any one of them less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which definitely fed into the jealousy section that we talked about earlier. Like, you're not losing anything, and if you can be communicative and say, hey, I feel like I'm not getting as much time with you, or that kind of thing, then yeah, okay, that might be something that you'd have to negotiate. But as far as affection goes, I love their chapter, like you were saying, Colin, on abundance. There's abundance in love. I'm fully capable to love more than one person at the same time. In my life, it's happened before. Like, it doesn't detract from anyone or anything. We're fully capable of spreading as much love as possible.
Yeah, and we're taught to see love as a zero-sum game. Like, the fear is like, if you're not married by the time you're 30, no one could possibly love you, as if there's only so much love to go around. But that's just really not the case.
I do think it's important to know all of this is true. You can have an abundance of love, but they also mention that if your partner doesn't want to be in an open relationship, you should not force them to be. Like, they had a heartbreaking story over a relationship that ended because one partner was poly and the other was not. And that's fine. And I think the two of them recognizing what they needed, one who wanted a more one-on-one experience, the other who wanted an open love experience, both are valid options. The problem is there's a lot of heartbreak when two partners can't get those to align.
Yeah.
But you need to be mature and let it end if you're in that situation.
Yeah. I very much, I was like reading along with the author, and they kind of made a joke about how they were like, well, based on our experience, we would love to say that all you have to do is pull that person into the community and like teach them and show them. And then all of a sudden they're going to think, yeah, this is the greatest thing ever. But that's not real. There are plenty of people who are fulfilled by a monogamous relationship, and that's what they're looking for. And while I would definitely encourage people to like question why they've decided monogamy is right for them and make sure that it's something that's actually fulfilling them versus something that society has ingrained in them to believe is true, if it turns out that, like, no, monogamy is what's right for me, you absolutely need to demand that from whatever partner. And if that partner can't fulfill that for you, then it probably isn't going to work out for you two because you're not fulfilling each other.
Yes. And every relationship, part of their manifesto is it needs to be fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if it's not being fulfilling, then it needs to end.
Yeah.
And that should be true for everyone. Like, one of the things that I detest about the marriage narrative is you've chosen this person, you've made your bed, you need to lie in it. So in a marriage where the love is dead, or a partner has become abusive, or any reason that it's not fulfilling anymore, this idea that you're stuck in your situation, no, you're not.
Yeah.
Like a relationship needs to be fulfilling. And there are relationships out there that last decades and they are fulfilling.
Definitely.
I think Colin's parents have one of the best marriages I've ever seen, and they've been together for freaking ever. Yeah. But then there's, like, my parents are divorced, Marcella's are divorced, and that's fine too. That doesn't mean that love failed. It just meant that relationship was not a saga for decades.
Yeah.
They talk about in the book regarding whether polyamory is right for you or not. Something that they mention is polyamory should not be used as a band-aid for something that is in your monogamous relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So Colin and I were in a long-distance relationship for 3 years. As I mentioned, I think when Colin and I started dating, I had no idea that we'd be married later. Like, that was not part of the plan. The two of us started dating, and I thought we were just going to be together for like 3 months or something. And effing. I had no idea that we would be in a long distance relationship when I went back to London. I had no idea that would snowball into a year in Los Angeles. And when it became a second year in Los Angeles, the two of us started having some issues. And so we experimented with the open relationship. It did not work for us. And the reason it didn't work is because neither of us are actually polyamorous.
Yeah.
Both of us, in our truest heart of heart, are monogamous. We were just using the open relationship as a band-aid for the fact that we were both done not living in the same place as each other.
Mm-hmm. So that was the wrong way to go about it. And that's how they recommend against that approach in the book.
And I think what is the mature thing is, for people who don't understand this lifestyle, they look at their own life and they're like, this is all the reasons it doesn't work, is because it didn't work for me, and says it didn't work for me, it's not going to work for anybody else. No.
Because that is valid in all scenarios.
Yeah. Like, no. It's just, I think, being honest with your truest self. So if you're looking at your preferences and your lifestyle and you honestly are like, I am monogamous, then that's what works for you. But there are a lot of people out there who, if they honestly look at themselves, they're not. They're polyamorous, and that is the way for them to live their most ethical self, and they should be free to do that judgment free.
Yeah. Another section that I found interesting that, none of us have experience in yet. Children.
Mm-hmm.
In the lifestyle. What I found really interesting is they kind of went into not only what it is to raise children in a polyamorous relationship or in a house with like multiple adults that are partners. They really went into setting boundaries for kids as well as sexual education for kids, which I think is so important. And the more we educate kids, our thesis statement, if you teach kids young, then they'll have less of these ingrained fears and judgments on their own sexuality and the sexuality of others as they grow up, and they'll have a healthier relationship with sex. I think that even these two people who are very much like sex advocates were proponents of, you know, all parents have to make their own decisions about what kind of sexual information their children should have at any given age. And like finding the balance between offering too much information, which might seem scary or overwhelming, and too little information, which might leave the child with a message that naked bodies and sexual arousal are so dangerous and embarrassing that it's not okay to even talk about them. They pull from the same research that we pull from, you know, countries in Europe where sex education for children of all ages is routine have extremely low rates of teen pregnancy. Because everybody's informed as to how everything works and what the risks are, and you don't want to scare them into thinking that, you know, like, you can never have sex and be safe, but you also want to make sure that they know how to be safe.
Agreed, and I think an interesting point that they made is oversharing.
Yeah.
You know, and which we haven't talked about much because a lot of the situations we hear are from people who grew up with zero information. But it is possible to overshare or to... You know, the mind develops. You can't give it everything at go one. Could you imagine trying to share kink culture with someone who is not going to grow up to enjoy kink culture?
Yeah.
Or, you know, there are certain things that you got to learn as options, but you need to be within a certain mind state to compartmentalize it and know how it fits within your own life. And I don't know, Marcel, what's your opinion on that? Like, not sharing kink culture until a certain age.
I think that I kind of think that it's something that has to be talked about when people start exploring pornography or get to the age that they're exploring pornography, which is why I think that kink culture is probably something that you should talk to kids when they reach their teens, because otherwise their first experience of it is going to be porn, which isn't realistic, and it isn't like, you're not understanding the respect for the dom and the submissive, or, you know, like, there's just so many things that can make it seem, that can ingrain specifically in men that it's okay to abuse women and that kind of thing, instead of showing them the background or the reasoning or the health aspect behind the BDSM community specifically. So yeah, I agree that it's not something that you tell your kids like, oh, hey, this is how you tie the knot so that you don't lose circulation to the arm. But I think it's worth a conversation to be like, hey, you're at an age where you're going to start masturbating, have already masturbated, and you're probably going to start looking into porn online. When you see these kinds of things, I want you to know that it's unrealistic to real life expectations. And especially when you get into the different kinks, there's a lot of things that have to be done for safety that aren't involved in these videos, that make these videos unrealistic and teach you unrealistic things.
I guess when I was saying kids, I was thinking a lot of first round sex talks happen with like children.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Whereas I agree with you. I think once you get to teenage years, you can start handling a lot more information. And I would love if sex education in America was a year-round thing, and they taught abstinence as an option. If they taught, polyamory as an option. If they taught kink as an option. If they gave all of this in like a mind frame to understand all of it as various options. And if this was kind of given in a form of a mature sex ed within, the later junior high or mid-junior high. It's so hard to know when, like, is the right time, because also kids develop at different ages.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that would be excellent to talk about, like, in teenage years. But anything beforehand, I think, should be, like, You're a child. You're not totally oblivious to the world around you.
But they don't need to know everything.
Yeah. I think just genitals and interacting with each other is as much as, like, anyone before the age of 10 can really handle.
Yeah. They don't need to know
Yeah.
everything. Mm-hmm. Or, I don't know, I suppose you should respond not only to their age and maturity, but their curiosity, you know. If they have questions, you should answer honestly.
Yeah. I don't know if I agree with lying to your kids. Well, they talk about this in the kid book, is like there's a difference between lying and telling them everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Being
You have
selective.
to strike the balance.
Which I guess is up to the parent to decide. They know their kid.
They do. They should.
They should.
They ought to, I suppose. I guess I wanted to see if we had any criticisms of this book. It can't all be positive.
I do have one.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I was kind of curious going into this book with is, I guess the reason they didn't touch on it is it may not be their target demographic, but, you know, people who have social anxiety, how they could potentially handle a polyamorous relationship, you know, or any other kind of, like, mental... Is illness the correct word?
Yeah.
Yeah, but basically kind of mental blocks that would absolutely prevent them from some of the aspects of a polyamorous relationship. How would you handle someone who suffers with clinical anxiety, or is someone who has clinical anxiety not seeking a polyamorous relationship, or would it be ill-advised for them to do so? I think that's one way that the book kind of let me down.
Wouldn't you say that would be covered by knowing yourself?
Possibly. I think that would be something that I don't know if it would be tackled in the book, or if it would just be if I could have a conversation with these two, or especially with Dossie regarding it. I would just be interested to hear what she has to say on the subject.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah, and the book can't address absolutely everybody. Like we said at the very beginning, this third edition does a really great job, and I think our authors have done all the necessary work to include a lot of different orientations and, like, just different types of people, different modes of sexual expression. You know, but it does still center the experience of sexual poly or polycurious people. I don't think that's a bad thing, because it is essentially a book for them. And they do address asexuality, and
they try to be so inclusive. They really,
do.
really do. But at the end of the day, every book has a target audience, and they're very, very clear with who their main demographic is, and I think anyone that they can get in addition to their main demographic is just a bonus.
Yeah. I want to applaud them for the way that they treat gender and everything that they wrote. Like, it was very clear that they wanted to make sure that they were communicating that every person, no matter their gender, could be either part of the relationship, or either any issue could be applicable to anybody. And then I also want to praise them for their intersexuality, because at the very beginning they cover, you know, what is it like to be Black and poly, and what are those stigmas that are different than the stigmas of a polyamorous relationship anyway, just because of the racism in the world. And so, yeah, I would applaud them for that.
They do a great job with that, and around the time they talk about being Black and poly, they also talk about the stereotype of like middle class, slightly older white swingers as being as being okay in, you know, as long as it's done ethically, but not representative of the community that they. I mean, because this is still a bit of a manifesto, and so they're sort of envisioning a somewhat utopian vision of their sexual world, and so they do a good job of addressing that representation.
Marcella, do you have any criticisms of the book?
I want to be a more constructive human being and give them constructive criticism, but I don't. There isn't anything that I flagged and was really angry by, or not angry, but just like upset by. I really came at it thinking like, hey, this is what worked for them. This is what they want to share. This is the knowledge that they have as therapists as far as conflict resolution and keeping relationships healthy. Yeah, I really liked it.
And it still gets my recommendation. If you're at all curious about ethical non-monogamy, this is definitely the place to start. And it's just, I think everyone, not only is it a great relationship book for everybody, but if you want to be an open-minded person and kind of understand what polyamory is about, then you should also give it a read.
I mean, honestly, going into this, I didn't know what to expect because it is highly recommended in all sorts of book lists. It's been mentioned on NPR. You know, it came in with high praise. Like Marcella called it her Bible before we started reading it.
It has a web series adaptation and a stage adaptation.
You know, it's got high praise, but I didn't really know what to expect going into it because, you know, I think anytime you read a book where their main demographic isn't necessarily you, it can be a bit of a struggle, but I absolutely loved it. I'm not going to be polyamorous, but I do think that this is a great book, and I agree with Colin. Everyone should read it. Whether you're interested in ethical non-monogamy or not, it will give you something to take away.
This is the antithesis to Joy of Sex. This is what I want. This is what I wanted Joy of Sex to be.
They almost mention it in here.
Oh, they do?
They mention it without directly mentioning it.
Nice.
How? I didn't catch that.
Let me grab it. Hold up. I found
the
quote I wanted
disinformation?
earlier. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I'm on page 251. How can we learn good sex? The mythology that has it that once you start having sex, it will all come naturally. And if it doesn't, then you must have some deep-seated psychological problem, right? We're not sure why sex stands alone in this regard. If you want to get good at anything, from cooking to tennis to astrophysics, you're going to have to put in some effort and time into learning how. One friend of ours had her first orgasm at the age of 34 after reading for the first time in one of the sex manuals that became popular in the early 1970s that it was okay for her to masturbate. She'd grown up in a generation that told masturbation would make you sick or crazy. So, anyway, it's interesting because The Joy of Sex has a lot of flaws to it, but they do say it's okay to masturbate. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way, like, if you read through this book and all the recommended reads that they have at the end, Joy of Sex is not in there. I'm sure they're very anti it, but they did acknowledge that that is something that this person read without directly calling it out.
Nice.
Good point. Yeah. Interesting.
Some of the recommended reads that they do have in here that I am very curious to read going forward. They mentioned this a couple times. It's called the book is called The Intimate Enemy: How to Fight Fair in Love and Marriage, written by George R. Bach and Peter Winden. It was published in 1968. They acknowledge that given the publishing date, it's got some slightly outdated language, but it's still very good, and it has some excellent points on how to have a fair fight in a committed relationship, which is something you got to know how to do. There's no sugarcoating it. Like, you shouldn't be fighting with your spouse every single day, but you're going to fight with them. You live with them. You have sex with them. You share a bank account with them. These are stressful situations. And on top of that, they also have Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life, by Marshall B. Rosenberg and Arun Gandhi, published in 2003. One thing I'm very interested in is Reclaiming Eros, Sacred Horrors and Healers, by Susan Blackburn and Margaret Wade. It's interviews with people all over the world who practice sex work as healing.
Ooh, that does sound interesting.
Mm-hmm. And then last but not least is Living Together, A Legal Guide for Unmarried Couples, published in 2008. I would love to read this because, as I mentioned before, I have very complex feels regarding marriage, despite the fact that I am a married woman. And I would love to know what they have for legal advice for people who don't necessarily want to be married, but they are, spiritually bound to another person. And what the legal ramifications are of that. And especially since this week at my company, they brought someone in to talk to us about living trusts and wills, because I did not know this, but despite the fact that you're legally married doesn't necessarily mean that when you die, everything goes to your spouse.
Oh, no.
It goes into probate, and then if I were to die tomorrow, everything I own goes into probate, and Colin would have to challenge the courts and prove that he is my legal spouse to get everything.
Oh, no.
I know. I did not know that. So, anyway, Stella, are there any books that they reference that you're interested in?
There are a couple that I'm interested in, but I really wanted to point out the shade that they sent in Secret Shade. Like we mentioned, as you mentioned and brought up, they didn't bring in Joy of Sex into their recommended reading, or did they even name it inside of the book? However, they do list Joy of Gay Sex in the recommended reading book, and I think that's 100% a shade call out to the original book, because fuck that book. I'm dancing. You can't see it, but...
Yeah. Oh, another additional kudos to our authors for being really woke on gender way back in 1997. They were pretty ahead of the curve here. The first publication has really no judgment at all for transgender and gender non-binary people, and they have done a lot of work to making this applicable to people who have, non-standard gender expressions. And so I think they did a great job, and they have been doing for years.
The other book by them that I really, really want to read is When Someone You Love Is Kinky.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then Radical Ecstasy. I feel like it might give me pro tips as to how to communicate who I am to people who are like, what? But yeah.
Well,
so,
Excellent.
does that do it?
I think that does it.
I think so.
Good book report.
Good book report.
Like us on social media. Leave us a review.
Smash that like button.
Colin will write you a poem.
I'll write you a poem if you leave us a review.
I am Megan.
I'm Marcella.
I'm Colin.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Read the
We'll
book.
agree that the concepts will contribute to the rearing of a mature person.
An absence of
Oh, yeah, you don't have to be thinking about sex.
that it continues in the present.